In this video, we'll talk about safety as well as workers' compensation. Safety are the things you should be doing to keep your workplace safe. Workers' compensation is if there is an accident and someone is injured while they're at work. The most commonly referred to law regarding safety is OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. The act itself is a law that was passed by Congress, but it is a regulation. It acts as a regulation more than a law itself. What the Occupational Safety and Health Act does is create the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, also known as OSHA. That agency on its own is able to make rules, not laws, but rules that are enforceable as if they were a law, and the government can punish someone or a company if they don't follow those rules. The OSHA Act didn't only create OSHA, the agency, it also created OSHRC and NIOSH. OSHA, the agency, is the one who administers the OSHA Act. It's the one that has agents that goes out and inspects workplaces. It's the one that can write citations. It's the one that can enforce any rule that they put in place. So that is the agency that does that. But then it comes to a question of, where do they get the rules? How do they become rules? Congress, the reason it created this agency is because they're not going to talk about every single regulation to ever be enforced or to put into place. Every time there's a new chemical, every time there's a new danger that is discovered, anytime there's anything like that, they don't need to create a new law. They created OSHA to take care of that for them. That being said, their decisions are still politicized and can take a long time. So as part of the OSHA law, there are limits on what OSHA can do. But there is OSHA, the administration that takes care of it. Where do the rules come from? NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. NIOSH is a group of scientists and professionals that take things from work to study their effects and how they can be dangerous to workers. There are physical effects, but how much physical abuse can a body take before it actually becomes harmful to the body? Working in an office and lifting a stapler and stapling papers together is normal for a lot of people, but there is a limit where if you do that for long enough every day, all the time, that someone might begin to get carpal tunnel or some other injury of the hand. If someone is doing much more heavy lifting than, say, stapling papers, how much should they be able to lift? There's a reason the mail, the UPS, the FedEx, all of the delivery services have a limit of 70 pounds on a package, because OSHA found out that 70 pounds is the limit that a normal person can take on an everyday basis for their bodies. You can ship more than that, but you have to give a warning and pay extra, because then those companies or those employers have to require more than one person to be lifting that package at a time. But those are the sorts of things that NIOSH studies. How much physical weight can someone lift? How much benzene can be in the air before it actually destroys your lungs or affects your body just in a negative way? And what they do is they make a recommendation and say, X amount of this thing, lifting, benzene in the air, whatever it is, X amount of noise does destroy the eardrums after X amount of time. And so OSHA, the administration, makes the rule and says, okay, at work, you can't have more than a certain number of decibels over a certain number of time. Usually they do it on an 8-hour workday. So you have NIOSH that makes the rule, or that does the studies and recommends a rule, and then you have OSHA, the administration, creating and enforcing the rules. It being a government agency, that's the only thing that can enforce those rules. If someone has a complaint, OSHA will send in its investigators and their agents. They'll go look at it and make sure everything is okay or not, and then they can write a citation, they can give fines, they can do all of those sorts of things. If someone disagrees with it, also, it's a government agency. So you can appeal that to the courts. OSHRC also exists as part of the OSHA Act. OSHRC is the OSHA Review Commission, the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission. If you get a citation for an OSHA violation, you don't go straight to court. You have to go through OSHRC first. The reason you go through OSHRC is because OSHRC knows OSHA. It's not expected that just a general judge out in the public will know OSHA and know the dangers very well. And in the trial part of the court case, that's the only place you can get facts out into the record. The rest of the time, you're just you're just depending on judges siding with your interpretation of a law. So, for the trial level case, OSHRC is there to be able to get a good, knowledgeable, technical, all of the evidence into the record so that it's there, so that later on the higher up judges, if it's appealed, are able to deal with it. So, you have workplaces. NIOSH does studies and makes recommendations to OSHA about what kind of rules it should make. OSHA administration makes those rules and goes out into people's workplaces to write a citation if they're not following it. And if that company doesn't agree with what OSHA found, they can appeal it to OSHRC. If they don't like what happens at OSHRC, they can appeal it again, but then it just goes to the federal circuit courts. So in Michigan, if I was written up by OSHA, and there's also a state level MyOSHA, by the way, Michigan OSHA, if I don't like what happened, I can try to defend myself, but I would do that in front of OSHRC to have the citation overturned. And then if that doesn't turn out the way I want, I would then appeal it to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then it goes through the federal courts from there. So that's how OSHA works as a regulation. With all of that, OSHA does have a lot of very specific standards for general industry. They also have different standards for maritime or agriculture as well, but just in general, there are specific standards. But just in case something doesn't fall under a specific standard, there is a general duty clause. The general duty clause says each employer shall furnish to each of his employees employment in a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to his employees. So even if OSHA hasn't gotten around to making a specific standard, even if they haven't discovered a danger, even if that sort of thing on a federal level hasn't happened yet, if a dangerous condition exists at a workplace, it is up to the company to keep the employees safe. The theory behind this is if a company is making money off the labor of an employee, the company has to keep that employee safe. The company cannot just recklessly have employees doing work when the company knows that employee might be harmed, especially when it's a for-profit venture. If someone is injured at work and OSHA needs to prove a claim against the company, these are the elements that OSHA must prove. There are four. The first one, the workplace hazard was allowed to exist. The second, the hazard was or should have been recognized by the employer. The third, the hazard caused or was likely to cause death or serious physical injury. And four, feasible means exist to abate the hazard that were not used. So workplace hazard was allowed to exist. This is especially applicable if it's the second or third time someone was harmed, or if someone mentioned it to their boss before, then that puts the employer on notice. And so now that they know that a hazard exists, that they have to correct it. The employer has to correct it. The hazard was or should have been recognized by the employer, even if someone did not put the company on notice, like I just talked about. If you can use common sense, especially if someone has been part of an industry for a while and knows, the ins and outs, if they should have known there was a problem, then that counts as well. The third, the hazard was or likely caused or was likely to cause death or serious physical injury. Someone does have to get hurt. If a hazard exists, a lot of people say it's a lawsuit waiting to happen. It is waiting to happen because someone can't sue and OSHA can't write a citation if no one's actually been hurt yet. And feasible means exist to abate the hazard that were not used. We have a lot of technology to keep people safe. We have a lot of, masks or gas masks to keep people's lungs safe. We have a lot of safety harnesses to keep people from falling off of, the sides of structures if they're building a tall building or a bridge. But if there's something that no one knew about, you can't write a company up if it was something that no one could have ever imagined happened, and if there was no safety equipment or safety standard that the company could have used. But if there was, then the company has to use it. A good example of the breach of the general duty clause can be seen in the Perez versus SeaWorld case. In that case, Perez was a trainer within SeaWorld, and she worked with orca or killer whales, and she was doing a show in front of a live audience, and the whale dragged her to the bottom of the pool and waited for her to drown, and then wanted to play with her like she was a toy. She passed away from this incident in front of everyone, but if you remember from the elements of the claim I just made, it doesn't matter how dramatic or traumatic, it is for anyone else who can see it or the audience or anything like that. With OSHA, we're only talking about the safety of the actual person. We'll go through the 4 elements that we just spoke about. The first, a workplace hazard was allowed to exist. Yes, it existed. This woman worked with killer whales in a deep pool with stone or cement sides. It's a dangerous environment for people to be in, and it was allowed to exist by SeaWorld. The second, the hazard was or should have been recognized by the employer. This can be tricky for an employer because the employer can't just not have safety standards, because then they would fail the 4th element, that feasible means exist to abate the hazard that were not used. But in this case, SeaWorld, they say, did recognize it because SeaWorld had some safety precautions in place for her to not be injured. They had wet works, they had dry works where you weren't actually in the pool with the whales or dolphins or whatever animal they were working with at the time, and it had other general safety precautions that it took. But that shows that SeaWorld, as the employer, knew there were hazards, and that's why they had safety precautions. The third element, the hazard caused or was likely to cause death or serious physical injury. It did cause death to Ms. Perez. And fourth, feasible means exist to abate the hazard that were not used. And the question kind of came up about what works versus dry works. Why was she in the pool? Could she have done an effective job not in the pool? I suppose the trick where the trainer comes up from underwater on the whale's nose, and the whale comes straight out of the water with the trainer on the nose, and they both do a flip and fall back into the water. Obviously, something like that couldn't be done on dry works where the trainer is standing outside the pool. But the rest of the show, having the whales or dolphins or whatever they were working with do all the tricks, could still be accomplished by the trainer standing outside of the pool and giving signals from there. To defend itself, SeaWorld contested the second and fourth elements of that claim. The second element, the hazard was or should have been recognized by the employer. SeaWorld argued that it was part of the regular business of SeaWorld and therefore should not be recognized as a hazard. The show could not go on, SeaWorld said, if that was an official recognized hazard, and so SeaWorld would cease to exist, SeaWorld argued, if that hazard was recognizable and enforceable under OSHA. SeaWorld also contested the fourth element, that feasible means exist to abate the hazard that were not used. SeaWorld contends that it had extensive training for all of its trainers and had taught them how to control the animals, how to be able to swim with them, and how to avoid incidents like the one that happened with Ms. Perez. SeaWorld's defense failed on both of the claims, the counterclaims that it made. Regarding the second element, the hazard was or should have been recognized, the courts eventually said it is a recognized hazard. The hazard of doing that job is not critical to the infrastructure of the United States. It's not critical to anything. It's entertainment. It took about 4 years from the date of Ms. Perez actually being involved in the incident until OSHA coming out and investigating, until they wrote the citation, until SeaWorld contested the citation in front of OSHRC, going to the circuit court. The circuit court makes a decision, writes a decision. It took about 4 years. Since the death of Ms. Perez, SeaWorld switched to only dry works. Because of the way court works, and I won't go into it and bore you here, you can't use that as evidence that they knew it was wrong. But you can use it for other things, and that is partially why SeaWorld's defense failed on both of its defenses on both of the elements. As far as the hazard was or should have been recognized by the employer, the court said it doesn't matter that that's the nature of the business. SeaWorld is not critical infrastructure to the United States. SeaWorld can change its business, and even if it's not as exciting because a trainer doesn't come out literally on the nose of a killer whale, it can still do tricks. It is still impressive, and there's no loss to the American economy. Think Commerce Clause. There's no loss to the American economy if they only do dry works. So, as far as it being a recognizable hazard, yes, it is recognizable. So SeaWorld should have recognized it. And then the fourth element, feasible means exist to abate the hazard that were not used since the day that Ms. Perez was involved in the incident and passed away. SeaWorld had switched to only dry works so that none of the trainers were ever in the pools with any of the aquatic life. So there was also no incidents, and no one had passed away or been attacked or anything have happened because of any of the dangers that were associated with Ms. Perez's case. So the court did say, well, feasible means do exist, and there weren't any accidents regarding dry works prior to Ms. Perez's death. So those means to abate the hazard existed, and you did not use them until someone actually died from them. So, between those two elements failing, OSHA's claim was in full force again, and SeaWorld lost the case. OSHA uses a slightly different way to prove its case if a specific standard exists. To prove there's been a violation of an OSHA safety standard, there are still 4 elements. The first one is an applicable standard exists. The second is a standard was not complied with. The third, one or more of the employees were exposed or had access to the hazard. And the fourth, the employer knew or should have known of the hazard. To illustrate this case, we'll take a look at the R. Williams construction case. This case took place at a construction site which included some land that was too steep. There is a specific standard about how steep land can be before you need to have it shored up with machines or jacks so that it doesn't collapse on anyone. In this case, they had shoring machines and the land was shored up, but the construction was moving on down the way a little bit. So they had taken the shoring machines out and the jacks out of that section and moved them away, but there was still some work to be done. The boss sent some employees, 2 employees, down into the trench to do some work, and the land collapsed. When that happened, it killed one of the employees and injured another. Using the elements of this case, an applicable standard exists. Yes, there was a standard about how steep the ground can be before it needs to be shored up. The second, the standard was not complied with. Also true. This standard was not complied with because it was not being shored up at the time. The third, one or more employees were exposed or had access to the hazard. Yes, they were exposed to the hazard when they went into the trench without it being shored up. And 4, the employer knew or should have known of the hazard. Yes, they should have known of the hazard. They knew about the hazard. It was shored up at some point, and then they had taken it down to move on with construction. Notice for the specific standard that the employee doesn't even actually have to be injured. They just have to have exposure or access to the hazard. You don't even have to be injured for this to be a claim. But a lot of times OSHA doesn't find out about something until someone is already injured. R. Williams Construction tried to defend itself by saying all of the employees had trench safety training. And some of the employees in the case did talk about, yes, they did have trench safety training. The company also said because they had that safety training, the employees should have known that the trench wouldn't have been safe and they should not have gone down there. This defense failed because if you go back and look at the elements, the fourth element is the employer knew or should have known of the hazard. Notice it is the employer. It is not the employee. The essence of work depends on an employee doing what the employer says. And if not, that can be insubordination and they can lose their job. Understanding that, if an employee can lose their job for not doing what the employer said, that's why we put the burden on the employer to keep the workplace safe. Because if not, if the employee says no to the boss, there's a much higher chance that that employee will get fired and lose their livelihood because they're trying to stay safe. So even if the employees did know it was dangerous, if the employer told them to do it and they did it, then the employer breaches the OSHA safety standard. So OSHA won on this case as well. The employer was at fault for sending the employees into a dangerous work site. OSHA's enforcement comes from two places: OSHA inspections and complaints of employees. OSHA is a government organization with limited funds, so it does have to prioritize where it looks. In either case, because OSHA is a government organization, it has to get a warrant to search a work premises. The warrant is pretty easy to get for OSHA since that's its job to do, but it does have to have it before it shows up. The inspection can be unannounced by OSHA, but when an OSHA officer comes to inspect, a representative from the company does have the right to be with the OSHA inspector all the time during the inspection. Although the person can be with them, although the company representative can be with the OSHA inspector, they have to be respectful, they can't intimidate the OSHA inspector, and they can't interfere with the inspection. As a side note, when the company can have a representative with the OSHA officer, that just means that someone from the company can be with the OSHA officer. The company can choose who it wants to accompany the OSHA officer, but the officer can do interviews to employees, asking them questions about the workplace. When that happens, whoever the company chose to represent them does not have to be in the room. The idea is that a company can't send a manager into a room with the employee, intimidating the employee into giving correct answers. OSHA wants to be able to have a full unfettered version of the truth, and the manager just being there is intimidating to a lot of employees. So they want to be able to get the real story. So if an employee is with the OSHA officer, that counts as having a representative for the company. When an OSHA officer isn't interviewing employees, he or she can walk around and look and to see what is wrong with the workplace. And they can look at everything when they're there. They can take notes while they're doing it. They can take pictures, those sorts of things within the workplace. And it doesn't matter if the company says it's secret or not, because it is part of the file and OSHA doesn't release those to the public. But once inside, that person can have access to the entire premises. Once the inspection is complete, the OSHA officer writes a report detailing everything that was seen during the investigation. From that report, OSHA will figure out what fines and citations should be given to the employer. If a citation is given, it does have to be posted in the workplace where the violation happened. If there was a gas leak, you have to put it where the gas leak was. If there was water pooling up on the floor from a leak and someone had slipped and fell, you have to put something on the wall right there saying there was a slip and fall here. The goal of that is for people to be careful while the company corrects the problem so that you don't have to have the same accident happening again. On those postings of the citation, the OSHA standard that's violated has to be listed on that posting. The monetary penalties, however much the company had to pay, has to be on there. And included in that citation is OSHA will give the employer a certain amount of time to correct the problem. That also has to be on the posting so that employees can know when it's there, and employees can know if their manager, if their workplace, if their company is keeping them safe while they're at work. Also, if it's not fixed in time, they kind of depend on the employees calling back OSHA to say this isn't fixed yet and the time has expired. If an employer doesn't agree with the citation, they have 15 days to contest it, and at that point it starts getting scheduled as a case within OSHRC, to go up the chain if they wanted to. A case I didn't include in your reading, but it's interesting, was where Walmart was found to be guilty of an occupational safety standard, not keeping that standard. In that case, they called it Blitz Day. Walmart calls it Blitz Day, but Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, whatever you want to call it. Walmart had advertised all these sales, and this is going to be the greatest thing ever. And I'm sure we've all seen videos of Walmart on Black Friday of people fighting over hand towels or TVs or whatever it is that's on sale at that time. Someone was trampled to death when opening the doors on Black Friday. It was a temporary employee, but remember, temporary employees are the same, treated the same legally as regular employees, and so that was an OSHA violation, and it was pretty clear that it was a violation. Now, Walmart didn't do it on purpose. They weren't, out to get this guy, so it was I think $7,000 citation in 2006. But Walmart did hold this up for a long time. It held up for 7 years through the court system. Part of me, thinks maybe Walmart just didn't want to be guilty to have something bad on its record. But also, Walmart has a lot of stores. It has thousands of stores in the United States. I don't know what the abatement period was on that citation, but Walmart would have had to fix that at every single store. So Walmart held it up in the court system for 7 years, and then it was finally found guilty, and it paid the fine, and by then, times had changed, and it had updated the stores. When the original event happened, there was Black Friday sales that started at 6 o'clock in the morning. Stores would open at 6 o'clock in the morning, and there would be lines, or in this case, hordes of people, just groups of people waiting outside that would storm into the door to get the best deal. In the meantime, culture has changed a little bit, maybe because these stores saw what happened at Walmart and didn't want it to happen to them, but stores started opening the day before. Stores started to never close. And with that, there was never a big group of people outside waiting to get in, so there was never a huge rush of people coming through the door. Someone wouldn't be able to be trampled if there weren't thousands of people waiting outside. In the meantime, culture has changed. Walmart was able to put in stronger doors, better gates, gates that you didn't have to lift up manually, that you could just stick the key in and do it electronically and stand out of the way if people stormed into the store. So it was able to update all of its stores to the newer, better, more safe standards. Companies do have to keep records of accidents that happen in the workplace. There are fines if it is found out to have not kept those records, and in those records, it has to be pretty specific about what happened to that person. Did they have to go to a clinic? Were they unconscious for any period of time? How long were they unconscious for? Did they break a bone? There are different levels. Did they die? Just things like that they have to report on. There are big fines if you don't report properly, and that sort of thing can be a bad practice. OSHA doesn't regularly go in and just inspect places, especially if there's no complaints. But if they go and find out that a company wasn't recording like they were supposed to, then there can be big trouble. And a lot of those fines go from just negligent claims to willful claims. This company's trying to hide the problem, and that's much worse. So there are record-keeping requirements for employees who are injured on the job. You have to record an incident within 6 days of it happening. In addition to OSHA, there's also the Mine Safety and Health Act. It's very similar to OSHA, but covers mines. Mining is very dangerous, and mines are covered by OSHA as well as the Mine Safety and Health Act. There is an administration as well for that law, and its duty is to inspect all underground mines 4 times per year. So it's a lot more strict than OSHA is. There are mining accidents, and they're always terrible. There's never like a minor mining accident. So the United States has laws saying, or regulations saying, the reporting has to be more rapid. Within the mines, there has to be oxygen supplies, things like that, in case they are blocked in for a while. Something to keep them alive until they're able to get the workers out. So there are specific industries like mining that have additional standards as well. Most industries are covered only by OSHA. Mines have some, maritime has some, different industries, but in general, OSHA is the standard everywhere, and all industries have to follow OSHA. So once you know OSHA, probably you're pretty good to go. Unless you work, somewhere else, then you should be trained at the beginning about, for example, in a mine. You should know and be informed by the employer that they are subject to another act, the Mine Safety and Health Act, and be trained on that as well. It's always better to prevent an injury rather than deal with it after it happens. The employer should examine potential hazards throughout the workplace. It does not help to put your head in the sand to be able to say, oh, I didn't know that should happen. If we can learn anything from the Perez and SeaWorld case and our Williams Construction case, it doesn't matter if the employer knows about it. It doesn't matter if the employer thinks it should be a hazard or is a hazard. It can still be a hazard. If a hazard exists, the company is expected to know about it, and the company has a duty to keep employees safe. So there should be a hierarchy of controls and of measures of things that can happen during an accident, or if something bad is happening where someone can be injured. And there should be safety rules. The safety rules should be clear, specific, consistent with one another, and strictly enforced. Because if you don't enforce it, the employees become lax, and then an accident could happen, and the company can be in a lot of trouble. Workers' compensation was actually the first worker protection law passed in the United States. And what it does is it compensates employees if they've been injured from anything arising in the course of or out of employment. What does that mean? In the course of employment means the time, place, and setting. Is this your usual workplace at the time you're supposed to be there? Arising out of employment means this is something that you usually do, and what is the underlying causation of the illness or injury or whatever happened. Workers' compensation is a right that the employees have, and as part of the law, the employee cannot even waive their right to workers' compensation. Even if an employee agrees in writing and signs a contract saying, while I work here, I waive my right to workers' compensation, it will not be recognized by the court. If someone is injured at work, they get workers' compensation. That is the exclusive remedy. They can't sue the company, they can't do anything else. They get workers' comp. With that part of the agreement, though, the company also has to agree it can't defend itself. There's not going to be a trial, there shouldn't be a trial. And so it gives up all defenses of contributory negligence, fellow servant rule, and assumption of the risk. The person can't sue the company, they just get workers' comp, and the company can't defend itself because of it. There's no trial to defend itself at. A good example of a case regarding something that is in and out of the course of employment is the Rodriguez versus City of Brighton case. In that case, Ms. Rodriguez was at work. She worked in an office working for the city, and she had to deliver some paperwork to another department. To get from her desk to that other department, she had to go down a flight of stairs. While on that flight of stairs, she fell and passed out and ended up having to be taken to the hospital. She had filed for workers' compensation, and the company, the employer, the city of Brighton, tried to defend itself to say she shouldn't get workers' compensation. She was at work. She was doing work. She was there during her normal time for working. So she was in the course of employment. The city said it didn't arise out of her employment. She fell downstairs. It wasn't explained. She didn't know why she fell. She didn't say that it was a hazardous environment. The stairs weren't uneven. None of the stairs broke. She just fell down the stairs. And they argued she could have fallen down the stairs anywhere. It just happened to be at work. She could have fallen down the stairs at home. She could have fallen down the stairs at the mall. She could have fallen down any stairs, and it would not have been a workers' comp claim. But just because she was at work, the city didn't think it should be liable. The court took the case and said, yes, she fell down at work. She was in the course of employment. And it doesn't matter that it was unexplained. If she had tried to do a backflip down the stairs, maybe it would have been her fault. If the stairs were falling, then it would have definitely been the work's fault, the workplace's fault. Since it was unexplained, it turned out she had some aneurysm that actually made her pass out. But at the time, it was unexplained. She was in the course of her employment, and she was doing her work like normal. She just happened to be at work, and that was enough that she has to be covered by workers' comp. She gets the workers' compensation because she was injured at work, doing normal working things. In the course of employment, she was at work, at the place she's supposed to be, during the time she's supposed to be there, arising out of the course of employment. It was part of her work to be delivering paperwork from one department to another, and she was injured doing those things. So she got the workers' compensation. Personally, I find it easiest to compare workers' compensation to no-fault car insurance in Michigan. If you want to drive a car, you have to have the insurance, and you can't waive that as a driver. The company can't waive it as an employer. If you want to drive, you have to have insurance. If you want to employ people, you have to have workers' comp. In a state like Michigan, which is no fault, if you get in a car accident, it's no one's fault. And the way insurance works is both people have to pay their own way. With workers' comp, as we talked about, an unexplained fall, something that just happened and no one knows why, the company has to pay. The company has that workers' compensation insurance, and it has to pay for that person's injury. Since no lawsuit will be filed, this person just has a right to workers' compensation and they just get it. The company has no chance to defend itself. There's nothing like contributory negligence, the fellow servant rule, or the assumption of the risk that the company can try to put blame on the employee. It's a right, the employee gets it, and the company can't defend itself. That's the deal, instead of employees just suing the company all the time. And now the company, first of all, usually is found guilty because the overarching law, common law that says if you want to make money off someone, you have to keep a safe work environment. And then now a company ends up having to pay the claim as well as paying lawyers, and it's just a racket for everyone. So that's what happens. The company has to pay, the employee can't sue. And because the employee can't sue, the company can't defend itself. It's a two-way street here. An example of this can be found in the Gross versus Industrial Commission of Ohio case. This was a minor, so it was the Industrial Commission of Ohio that was taking care of this case, but this person worked at a KFC and had an issue with the fryer. So the state was taking care of it, but the incident happened at a KFC. This person was asked to clean the fryer at a KFC, and he thought it would be funny to put water in the fryer. It makes a entertaining little explosion. He had done this a few times, very minor, had been told by the boss at least 4 times, stop it, don't do that. He was never disciplined, he was never suspended, he was never fired. He just was told by the manager to stop doing it, and he didn't stop doing it. So on this day, he put a lot of water into the fryer. Oil and water do not mix, especially really hot oil, and that creates a big fireball that came out and burned a lot of people. It burned him, third-degree burns, and several of his other employees. It was an accident. It happened at work. He gets workers' comp. I think we've established that in the past few minutes. The company didn't want to pay the workers' comp, especially because it was a long time. Not only were his injuries expensive to fix, but the company has to pay partial wages to that person until they are able to work again, which potentially means forever if that person is unable to work. He was eventually able to work, but before this happened, KFC didn't want to keep paying the claim. And they said it was contributory negligence because he should have known better. The managers told him not to do it. He continued to do it anyway. This is his fault. He put water into the fryer. There's a sign on the wall that says don't clean with water. There's a sign when you open the top underneath that says don't clean with water. There's a sign on the counter in front of it that says don't clean with water. It was everywhere, and he did it anyway. This is his fault. And I don't think anyone would have denied it was his fault. Assumption of the risk, similar line, to the contributory negligence. Listen, you were doing that dangerous thing. You assumed the risk of doing it. The court eventually said, that's nice, but there is no contributory negligence and there is no assumption of risk under workers' compensation or most employment laws in general. He did it. You knew he did it because you had told him multiple times in the past to not do it, but you didn't actually take any measures to correct his behavior. You never actually sent him home from work halfway through a shift because he did it. You never suspended him from work. You never even wrote him up. So after doing something 4 times that he thinks is very funny, and you keep saying, don't do it, but then you don't actually punish him, it's no wonder a teenager kept doing it. So eventually he did it. He was at work. He was in his employment. It was out of the course of his employment. You told him to clean the fryer, and you just didn't like how he did it. There is no defense for the company. It has to pay him the workers' comp. There was also an issue in this case where he was cleared to come back to work, but then he wasn't cleared to come back to work, and so at that point, the company fired him because he was supposed to come back to work but didn't. He had a doctor's note saying he's not able to come back to work yet, but the restaurant ignored that, and so they had fired him because of it. The court also found that to be retaliatory, saying that this is a right that the employees have. When they're exercising their rights, you can't fire them for exercising their right. So, since he was exercising workers' compensation as his doctor and as the court said, as the government said, you can't retaliate against him for that. So he continued to get the workers' comp even though they had fired him. If a company wants to fire someone for creating a dangerous workplace, they can. And in the Gross case, if they had fired him for creating a dangerous workplace and even injuring other employees, it would have been able to. You are allowed to fire someone for creating a dangerous workplace. But the way workers' compensation work is the company still pays that person's workers' compensation forever. Gross had burns on his face and on his upper body, and at some point, he's not going to need to pay for very much for that. But if there was an accident at work where someone's back was broken or something happened that could handicap someone that later on in life, 30 years down the road, something was affected by a broken back, or that person needed a wheelchair earlier than they would have needed to in life, or something like that happened, the original company would still have to pay for it. If something came out of that same injury, if the doctor can say, yes, this is related to that injury and this would not have happened if you didn't, for example, break your back, then the company has to pay for it. So the company is allowed to fire someone for creating a dangerous workplace, but that doesn't get them out of workers' compensation. They still pay the workers' compensation for however long it's needed by that employee. And that's usually dictated by a doctor. Keep in mind that some things are not covered by workers' compensation. You're not covered by workers' compensation until you are at work. If you park in the parking lot, it depends. Does the company own that parking lot? or are you parking at some other lot across the street? If the company owns the parking lot, and let's pretend it's across the street, you're parking in a company-owned parking lot, you are at work. And it's part of work that you park in that parking lot and walk across the street to your office or your workplace. If you get hit by a car crossing the street, that is compensable under workers' compensation because you've arrived at work and it's part of work to go to your desk or to your workstation. If the company doesn't own that parking lot and it's just a paid parking lot owned by a parking lot company, you're not at work yet. So you can park your car there and you can be walking across the same street to work. And if you're hit by a car, you haven't arrived at work yet. So it's not compensable under workers' compensation. Workers attending to personal activities can still be compensable if it's something that's expected throughout the workday. If an employee gets injured while in the bathroom, the company can't say, you weren't working. That's not part of your job. I'm not paying you to go to the bathroom. I'm paying you to be productive over there. It's understandable and expected that people will go to the bathroom throughout the day, and so that's covered. The same goes if they're pouring coffee and they burn themselves, or other regularly expected things throughout the workday. If someone is under the influence of alcohol or drugs, that's not part of the job, and even within the act, those two things, someone is never compensable under workers' comp if they're under the influence of a controlled substance or alcohol. If someone is far enough outside of work that it's not considered a normal part of the workday, then that's also not covered. Even though I got to work, if I left because my neighbor wanted to give me tickets to a sporting event later that night, and I left work to go pick up the tickets to bring them back to work so that I can go straight from there to the game, then that is not compensable. I've left work, I'm doing something personal, it's for my own benefit. If you're doing something for the benefit of the company, it is still compensable. If the boss says to the employee, I got some tickets, can you go pick them up for me? I'm really busy. And you leave work because your boss wanted you to pick up tickets for them to use, and now you're coming back. Now you're doing what your boss says. And if a random person on the street came up to you and said, oh, hey, I have some tickets, can you go get them for me? You would most likely say no. Since your boss told you to do it, you're doing it. And now you're doing things that are in the course of employment, that are arising out of employment. If your boss told you to do it, and it's for the benefit of your boss or the company or something like that, then it's arising out of employment. Even if it's something like a sports league, if you join a sports league out of your own, like you just really like volleyball and you joined a volleyball league and you're playing it, even if you're playing with a bunch of people from work, even if you create a team with the people from your work, but just on Thursday nights, you go to the local high school's gym and play volleyball with a bunch of other people. That is not workers' compensation just because you're with people from work. If your boss convinces you to play volleyball with a company logo on the shirt, and that way it's, good publicity for the company, now the company is getting a benefit because you're advertising for that company, and now it is covered under workers' compensation. The basic rule of thumb is the company benefiting? Are you doing something because your boss told you to, or are you doing something personal? If you're going that far out of your way to do something, if it's personal, if you're doing the volleyball league because you like it, if you're getting those tickets because you want to go to the game, it's not covered under workers' compensation. If you're joining the volleyball league because your boss wants you to, if you're going to get those tickets because your boss wants you to, now it's covered under workers' comp. Employers should require employees to report all workplace injuries as soon as possible. Treatment needs to be provided and the company has to pay for it. Don't try to keep it a secret, or maybe they won't say anything, or I don't know, because you can't claim negligence in workers' comp. If you think someone is injured, send them to the doctor right away. The company will have to pay for that doctor's appointment, but if it is an injury, it will just get worse over time, and the company will still have to pay for that injury, which is much worse because you tried to avoid sending them to the doctor in the first place. If there's a hazard that can cause an injury, You need to identify it, you need to be able to abate it, and have employees or even just the company create a way to avoid people getting injured in the first place. Also, don't be the boy who cried wolf. You can, as we've seen in the cases we talked about, contest a workers' comp claim, but if you just contest every single claim, there's not that many judges. There's not that many administrative law judges, and so they'll say like, oh, here's them again. They contest every single one, and so they stop taking you seriously after a while. And so the claim that really should be contested, maybe the person really is faking it, you'll probably be the boy that cried wolf and no one would have believed you. But if you only contest the ones that you seriously have a good feeling that the employee is just trying to take advantage and that they weren't actually injured at work, then you do have the right to contest it if you want. So the best way to do it is to just keep your workplace safe. You can look at OSHA standards if you want some guidance on how to do it. And remember that workers' comp is a right that an employee will get unless there's a really good reason they shouldn't. Other than that, it's best to just abate the hazard in the first place to keep a clean, safe work environment for your employees so that your company can be more productive.